The Soviet Union will be pleased to offer amnesty to your wayward vassal.
The Soviet Union? I thought you guys broke up.
Yes, that's what we wanted you to think.
Welcome to the Rage Hammer podcast, where I am examining the causes of Western civilization's gradual and apparently inevitable decline. So, Western civilization has entered a period of decline that coincides with two major events. One is the Enlightenment, and the other is the postmodern era. And additionally, three individuals figure prominently in the decline of the West. One is Machiavelli, the other is Hegel, and the final figure is Karl Marx. Now, the Enlightenment began in the 17th and 18th centuries and purportedly appealed to reason as a means of discerning the world. Specifically, Enlightenment thinkers were hearkening back to a classical understanding of logic and reason, as in the Romans and the Greeks. And additionally, that extended into the medieval period, the Dark Ages, so on and so forth. There's only one problem with the Enlightenment thinkers' approach. The Romans and the Greeks did not denounce the role of gods and their commandments and the institutions thereof. Enlightenment thinkers did. The institutions that arose in Greece and Rome were intimately tied to a social order resting on a foundation of religion. Enlightenment thinkers viewed social orders founded on religion as absurd. And the postmodern era has been an extension of the Enlightenment in many ways, with notable exceptions. Ideology rather than science guides the postmodernist, who rejects any notion of absolutes and sees in scientific law a confirmation of oppressive structures and hierarchies rather than a fact-based explanation of natural phenomena in the universe. Postmodernists, particularly of the Marxist variety, have increasingly concerned themselves with language and meaning. And where Marxist and their postmodernist heirs align is their Machiavellian concern with power. As Saul Alinsky once said, you organize for power. Now, the great cancers of the 20th and 21st centuries are both Marxist and Machiavellian in origin. Both schools of thought are primarily concerned with how to attain and maintain power over the lives of others. Before the rise of Marxism, the mercantilist system of Adam Smith's days, was dominant. It never actually went away. It was simply reborn with the modern corporation and misidentified as capitalism. The fact that mercantilism is traditionally designed to maximize exports on a national level should not lessen the assignment of the mercantilist approaches to the West, because the Western elites control exports from the East and from Africa and direct the trade policies of all countries globally accordingly. And this is one of the great legacies of Marxism. Blaming capitalism, which has never existed outside of a textbook or the written word, for the errors and sins of mercantilism. Now, Western economies have succeeded insofar as they have adopted aspects of capitalism, but they have never been fully capitalist. The reality is that Western economics is a mixing of theoretical approaches, just as Chinese economics is a theoretical hodgepodge. Now, in order to access Chinese labor and Chinese consumers, Western companies effectively become state-owned enterprises in China. First, they have to form a joint venture with a Chinese company, most of whom are de facto state-owned enterprises. Second, they must transfer their intellectual property to those joint ventures, effectively turning over their most valuable assets to the Chinese. And finally, they are vulnerable to state-sponsored hacking and IP theft. Now, both the Chinese and Americans retain controls of their economies and the actors within those economies through subsidies and national security laws that require cooperation with espionage efforts. Now, in China, it is clear who controls everything: the Communist Party. In America, the shareholder class controls everything. They are the de facto American Communist Party. It's not accidental that many of the left-wing activists arrested at these recent protests, and the protests before, like Occupy Wall Street, the WTO protests and whatnot, they're children of privilege in America. And it's not accidental that our universities have become mouthpieces of Marxist ideology. It's not accidental that our institutions, from our religious denominations to our charitable and philanthropic organizations to our government bureaucracies, they have become infested with Marxist ideology and Marxist activism. The Roman Catholic Church is the mouthpiece of liberation theology, which is undisputably Marxist in its diagnoses and solutions. It's also a hotbed of alternative sexual practices that are directly counter to its own scriptures and doctrines as espoused in the Catholic Catechism. Now, what you have to understand is what drives Marxism is never an outcry from the working class. It is a deliberate effort by the shareholder class to heighten the contradictions or increase tensions. Now, that's what I want you to key in on. Heighten the contradictions, because that's a critical phrase. And what Marxists do is they seek to infiltrate the system, not to reform it or to rescue it, but to break it into a million pieces. A Marxist enters the priesthood with the intention of identifying existing hypocrisies, magnifying those hypocrisies, and discrediting both the priesthood and the church, and thereby creating a process for the purposes of implementing greater change. It's not just the church, it is the party, the club, the civic association, the institutions and bureaucracies of government, and any other organization founded on human participation and involvement. Now, the goal is to make conditions so miserable that a radical solution will seem reasonable. Marxists are saboteurs. They are never anything but saboteurs. Now, the dialectic of Hegel, who I mentioned earlier, was designed to identify historical changes through the contradictions and crises produced by hierarchies and power structures. Now, Hegel believed that the liberal republic was the culmination or final solution to the dialectical change he identified, because he believed that the liberal nation-state contained within it the processes and the means to resolve those changes in a civil manner. You didn't need to have revolution past the liberal nation-state. Marx did not agree with this. For Hegel, as I said, liberal republics contained the means of resolving the crises of contradiction that would emerge in the dialectic, and Marx disagreed. Instead of trying to resolve the stresses of the mercantilist system in good faith, what Marx and his followers proposed was exacerbating those stresses in order to bring about total collapse. What I said earlier, the goal is to make conditions so miserable that a radical solution will seem reasonable. Now, the Marxist approach is the dominant paradigm in the West today. Even so-called conservatives such as Grover Norquist embrace the Marxist dialectical approach to achieving solutions. Now, Norquist has spent his career encouraging tax cuts that would increase deficits and the national debt in the hopes of eventually triggering fiscal collapse in order to implement his desired vision of the government. Neoliberals and neoconservatives have the same approach. Increase and exacerbate contradictions to a breaking point, triggering an eventual collapse in order to bring about desired change. Neoconservatives in particular have their genesis in Stalin's arch-rival Trotsky and Trotsky's disciple Leo Strauss. And neoconservatives are neither new nor conservative. Their nomenclature is the height of semantic disingenuousness. Both neoliberalism and neoconservatism should be called by their true and actual name, Marxism. These are long revolutions rather than sudden revolutions. Such revolutions are designed to take place over generations, even centuries. Now, here in the United States, we are seeing the fruit of the long Marxist revolution. The average American fatally associates Marxism with countries and regimes, and that's why they assume that the ideology failed with the Soviet Union and its satellite countries. Now, the Soviet Union and its satellites spent decades infiltrating Western institutions and groups, and we never purged ourselves of the Marxist infiltrators even after the fall of the Soviet Union. They still occupy our humanities departments, our social sciences disciplines. They are dominant in our seminaries. They control significant portions of both major parties. They are in elected offices, and they are in the permanent bureaucracy of the state. They occupy our corporations, ensuring the heightened contradictions through so-called diversity initiatives, workplace seminars on microaggressions and privileges, all designed to promote Marxist doctrine and groupthink under different names, but also to trigger that heightened contradiction. And one of the ways that you trigger that contradiction is to increase resentments among the groups that you create through these so-called diversity initiatives by dividing people. Now, they are dominant in our cultural apparatuses. They promote Marxist messaging and entertainment, be it television, movies, print mediums, music, and art. Marxists have succeeded to such a degree that even their purported enemies have resorted to employing Marxist methodology. As I mentioned earlier, you can see Grover Norquist in the Republican Party over the past 5 decades. The goal of so-called conservatives is not the rescue of government from the clutches of Marxists. It is the destruction of government institutions and civic processes. Now, Americans are now confronted with 2 major parties whose methods betray their Marxist leanings and practices. Both parties seek to utilize government not to serve the will of the American voters or the American working and middle class who comprise the majority of the country. Instead, they seek to utilize government to increase the frustration and the despair of those working and middle-class voters in order to convince them that the only solution is to jettison the government as it presently exists entirely. What I said earlier, and I will keep coming back to this, is that the goal of the Marxist is always to make conditions so miserable that a radical solution will seem reasonable. That's the critical principle here. And so when you're looking at why the government doesn't work, and you look at both major parties, the reason is because their goal is the same, to increase to heighten the contradictions, and thereby to bring about conditions so miserable that a radical solution will seem reasonable. So instead of blaming Republicans and Democrats and correctly identifying them for the Marxist saboteurs they are, we are being conned into blaming the government itself, into dismissing the Constitution and the Bill of Rights as antiquated and overdue, when in reality we have bad faith actors sponsored by America's shareholder class deliberately running our country aground with massive debt, grievance-based politics, and deliberately ineffective government. You want to heighten the contradictions? You want to make conditions so bad and so miserable that radical change seems reasonable. And the reality is that Donald Trump, our current president, aggravates and perplexes Democrats and establishment Republicans alike because he has co-opted their Marxist methodology and their playbooks to run two campaigns that are aimed directly at their long-term agenda, which is collapsing the West in order to usher in a globalist new world order. Again, you want to heighten the contradictions, and you want to make conditions so awful that radical change in the form of a new world order seems like a reasonable and even necessary solution. Donald Trump is a Marxist by methodology, just like the neocons and Grover Norquist and others within the establishment Republican Party. Trump simply works towards a different end, but his methods are the same, perverting processes, laws, and the overall system to accomplish a goal. Now, Marxism has been so successful in the United States that even those who openly condemn Marxism and communism embrace the use of Marxist tactics. This is the problem in the West. How to fight against Marxism without becoming a Marxist, either in tactics or outcomes. Now, the West has already lost its identity, and this is critical. That's why the embrace of Marxist tactics by those who espouse capitalism, Western liberal democracies, and Republicans' forms of government and human rights that limit government power is so telling. The West has no strong sense of identity left that would tell its people that their methodology and tactics are key to the erosion of Western values and identity. They don't even recognize Marxism as Marxism. And here's the other part of it that is critical. One doesn't negotiate with cancer cells or viruses. One does not emulate cancer cells or viruses. One simply kills the cancer or the virus. That's how you survive. If you are afflicted with cancer or a virus, you have to kill it. You have to eradicate it. And Marxism and its grievance-based offshoots are cancers. The answer is to kill the cancer. Part of restoring Western identity will involve reclaiming the virtue of force as a form of defense in the face of aggression, whether it is physical aggression or ideological aggression in the form of a long revolution through the infiltration of our institutions. Too often, when faced with liberals who are in fact orthodox Marxist, conservatives and traditionalists in the West have refused to recognize the reality in front of them. These are not their countrymen. Their brothers in Christ, are people who just, sincerely believe different things. Marxists believe in change for the sake of change, be it sudden revolutionary change or long revolutions through soft tactics, like gradual infiltration. And left unchecked, the Marxists will infiltrate until they have overrun every institution and social group. It's exactly what they've done in America, and it's what they've done in the whole of Europe. People in the West mistakenly believe that communism fell with the USSR. Communism was never fully eradicated. The Marxist infiltrators who had settled into our universities, our colleges, seminaries, our entertainment and media companies, and most importantly our government bureaucracies were never eradicated. They stayed behind, and they promoted Marxism as an ideology and Marxism as a tactic to generations of Westerners. They normalized it. They organized politically, and they have promoted both sides in all conflicts as part of their dialectical efforts to, again, heighten the contradictions of the Western system. The ultimate goal is always the same, to make conditions so miserable that you can force radical change. And as time passed, even so-called conservatives in the West have adopted Marxist approach and tactics. What conservatives and traditionalists failed to understand was the necessity of deploying hard force against the Marxist incursion. When confronted with apparently liberal encroachments on their board of trustees, at the churches, the universities, and schools, the conservatives decamped. They didn't fight a scorched earth approach to purge the invaders, who they still viewed as their brothers. They just called them liberals instead of what they were. These are not liberals. Western liberals have always been open to Marxism, and during the 50s, they were infested and overrun by the Marxists. This bore fruit in the radicalism of the 60s, with violent social upheaval and the mores and norms of the West challenged and eventually just completely overthrown. Worse still, these Marxists incepted the doctrine of Marxism into our curricula. They taught it into our schools, and they propagandized popular culture to drive their values to the detriment of everything and everyone opposed to their ideology. Now, the West still refers to these types as liberals, when they are in fact nothing more than Marxist. Now, this goes to the heart of the crisis in the West. Not only do we no longer know who we are as a culture and a society, we don't know who they are either. Most self-identifying conservatives in the West have been infected with Marxist ideology without even realizing it. We look at individuals who identify as conservatives such as Grover Norquist, Ronald Reagan, Newt Gingrich, and others of their ilk, and we think of these individuals as emblematic of modern conservatism. They are the antithesis of conservatism. Let's look at Ronald Reagan. He raised taxes 6 times in 8 years. He presided over immigration amnesty that rewarded illegal immigrants with a path to citizenship or permanent residency, and he almost quadrupled annual deficits from the Carter administration. This is not a conservative record. When Congress blocked him from intervening in Nicaragua, Reagan and his vice president George H.W. Bush presided over a program of drug smuggling, gun running, and gross illegality to intervene anyway. You talk about Grover Norquist. He's always openly advertised his desire to break the government. He's an anarchist. He professes conservatism, but he employs tactics that are clearly Marxist for ends that are almost anarchist. It's not enough to propose tax cuts to shrink government. You have to cut spending, and you have to cut the size and reach of government. Norquist understood this. He's not a dumb person. He just didn't care. At the end of the day, if he couldn't win the policies he wanted, he'd take piecemeal progress in the form of a tax cut and spiraling deficits and a debt that would eventually break his country and force radical concessions, regardless of the human cost and what it would mean in terms of America's diminished place in the world. What I said throughout this podcast, the goal is to make conditions so miserable that you can force radical change and make it seem like it's moderate or just even necessary by comparison to the misery that you have at the present time. You take Newt Gingrich. He is the dialectic in action. This is a man who used social issues as wedges to force concessions on financial issues. Newt Gingrich never cared for social issues or the long-term erosion of public trust in both the civic processes and institutions that were byproducts of his approach. Newt Gingrich openly desired to break the government in much the same way as Norquist. That's why we have government shutdowns, and our Congress can't produce an annual budget. It's why political consensus that aligns with the priorities of the voters is impossible. Our government lurches from one socially divisive focus to another, be it abortion, gay marriage, transgender rights, race, police brutality, political correctness, and speech codes. And in the meantime, over half of America's roads, bridges, and dams and levees are either structurally deficient or functionally obsolete. Our infrastructure is collapsing. Our educational system ranks in the 30s globally, even though it is the most expensive educational system both per capita and in terms of overall spending. To go to college in this country, you have to borrow your parents' tax dollars at an above-average market rate of interest, and you have to go into debt. If you go to college, you'll likely matriculate with a degree that's functionally useless in the workplace. It's exactly equivalent to your useless high school diploma. You will be taught what to think, but never how to think. And despite what so-called conservatives now preach and espouse, conservatism is not the repudiation of government. It is the embrace of both traditional values and traditional institutional roles, and a healthy wariness of sudden change in either. Conservatism is an ideology that promotes government, albeit within certain constitutional limits. It is the ideology that promotes government as a solution rather than a problem. It is the ideology that does the same for the church. Conservatism promotes strong institutions, either governmental or religious, and strong processes for both. It promotes respect for those institutions, those processes, and those traditions as a means of mediating our differences and achieving a civil discourse and a civil solution for our conflicts. Remember, Hegel's dialectic posited that the modern-day nation-state contained within it the processes and means to resolve dialectical conflict and change without revolution. Marx rejected that approach and insisted that the nation-state would be unable to resolve those contradictions and changes until the entire power structure and hierarchical system was brought completely down. Now, when you look at so-called conservatives in the West, particularly America, they have more in common with Marxists than actual conservatism. Their rhetoric, their proposed solution, and their methodology all points to bringing the entire system down. We have Dick Cheney insisting that Reagan-proved deficits don't matter. You have George W. Bush embracing a Medicare prescription drug benefit, expanding a surveillance state that is aimed at Americans rather than any external threat, and doing away with civic processes such as due process and individual rights such as, you have to have a warrant to do a search. He does away with these civic processes and individual rights that get in the way of his political success and his political power. His compassionate conservatism, along with that so-called New Democrat approach of Bill Clinton, was so compassionate that it allowed corporate fraudsters to issue mortgages to no income, no job, and no asset borrowers. And that led us to 2008's economic crisis, where the answer was socialism for the rich in the form of nearly $30 trillion in bailouts for banks and corporations. And the lesson is that if you're willing to break the law on a big enough scale, if you're willing to break the entire system, you can pull off a historic theft. When I said the goal is to make conditions so miserable that people will accept the unthinkable as a solution, that's exactly what happened in 2008. Before 2008, we'd have never believed that banks and the shareholder class can come to the government with their hand out asking for trillions in bailouts for a situation that they had created by lobbying the government to loosen borrowing restrictions and not enforce laws against mortgage fraud. But that's exactly what happened. And so if you're willing to break the law on a big enough scale, if you're willing to break the entire system through the Marxist dialectic, you can pull these sorts of thefts off. You can steal $30 trillion. You can embark on a war that is now 2 decades old and represents trillions more in theft. You can pile up obscene amounts of debt that threaten the security of the United States and the world at large. You can get away with whatever you like if you employ the Marxist dialectic and you have no principles other than change for the sake of change in service of power. And the way that you do this, the first way that you do this, is to attack meaning itself, to make it to where no one knows who they are or what they are, so that they can accept a Marxist who calls himself a liberal or a conservative as a liberal or a conservative. In the West today, there is no objective standard for meaning. You have Catholics who openly profess and engage in behavior that is explicitly condemned by both Scripture and the Catechism. And they receive the Eucharist, they attend Mass without any consequence. And I would say that there would be more outrage if the Catholic Church tried to excommunicate pro-choice laity than there has been over pedophile priests, many of whom have not been defrocked despite their child rape, the wanton sexual abuse, the rape of children. They haven't been defrocked, which means they haven't lost their status as clergy, and they certainly haven't been excommunicated. This is a church whose own clergy disregards the core doctrines of the church, and whose laity follows their shepherds down the primrose path to hell. And so you have these unthinkable outcomes in the Catholic Church where pedophile priests are being, maneuvered to different dioceses. They're never punished. The clergy in the new diocese and the laity in the new diocese isn't ever alerted to the fact that they have a sexual predator amongst their children. And so, again, conditions are so bad that you accept the unthinkable as a solution. And so things have gotten so bad in the Catholic Church that the laity, even when the full measure, and I still don't believe we have the full measure of like what the scale of child abuse is in the Catholic Church among the clergy. But even as bad as the revelations were, the clergy, having endured all the heresies of Vatican II, the clergy that wasn't following the doctrine of the Catholic Church, they accepted the piecemeal solutions offered by the Church. And they're still Catholic. And so you would think that that would be unthinkable. You would think that they would demand real change at the level of their clergy and at the level of the bureaucracies within the Catholic Church, but they really haven't effectively done so. And the reason is because things have gotten so bad that they just accept whatever. And it's virtually the same way in the Southern Baptist Convention, the United Methodists, virtually every other major religious denomination in the West. The Christian identity means nothing, because under Marxism it has come to mean all things to all people. There's no objective standard upon which even Christians agree as to what it means to be a Christian. So attacking the institutions from which the West derived moral meaning and moral significance has been a Marxist goal from day one. Depriving those institutions and their members of clarity and meaning has been the masterstroke of Marxism. And Western civilization is collapsing as a result because it no longer knows what it is. This has been Threat Level X, and I am your host, the Rage Hammer. This is the first in a series of podcasts aimed at explaining the ongoing collapse of the West under the assault of Marxism. Good night, and good luck, and God bless.